Welcome, welcome. All right, let's get started. So welcome to the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center's 2021 Spring ADRC Meeting. My name is Hannah Rosentrader, and I am a Program Operations Specialist here at NACC, sitting on the admin team, which is fitting for today's administrator session that's happening from 2:30 to 4:30 p.m. ET. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Emily Little, who is an administrator coming to us from UCSD ADRC. Hey, go ahead, Emily.
Thanks, Hannah. Before we kick off the agenda today, I'd like to actually thank everybody on the steering committee. We've met regularly over the last year. And with the administrators in the larger group in a fall informal meeting to help inform the topics of this meeting today. So we hope that it'll be an exciting agenda for you. We've tried to identify not only the administrative challenges resulting from the pandemic-related shutdown last year, but also the lessons learned. And we will have a panel of speakers to discuss both cautionary and encouraging tales about some of the changes that have been made over the last year and how we may or may not decide to carry them forward. So we are looking forward to your questions in the Q&A box, and the administrators will be helping to feed some of those questions to the speakers verbally in case people miss them in the text box. And we're hoping to have a very interactive discussion after the panel session. So without further ado, I think we should get started with some announcements and updates, starting with Cerise Elliott.
Hi, everyone, my administrators. It's been so many years. I miss you guys. One day we'll be together. If you saw on the NACC website, the next meeting is planned for maybe in person, October 8th and 9th in Los Angeles. I want to thank the administrators for having their regular meetings and coming up with the agenda for today, and also planning a social, because you know we're the social butterflies of the whole program. So thank you guys. Just a few notes. I told Emily if this is insufficient, you guys can organize a meeting and I'll do a special Q&A for you guys. And I'll be more prepared. So the NACC administrative team is brand new and they have a section in the agenda. And so they will introduce themselves. And so we'll have a new team, new procedures, and new goals for NACC. And we're looking always to the administrators to help facilitate and complete our information exchange with NACC, increase our data sharing and our collaborations. So today, let's see, I am going to answer your questions. Oh, the administrators, helped out this year, helping all of you answer your RPPR submission questions. As always, the administrators are on the ball to update the guidance that will be made in the fall to help you as a group understand the requirements for the RPPR. One new addition that we're going to start requesting is Section C of the RPPR. There's a section that is needed in addition to your publications. We need to utilize next year the description fields for websites and other internet sites. Each center has a website and we want documentation of your website and how you use it and what your demographics look like, who's using it, is it being used, and we want that information included in our progress reports. And Nina has some exciting information to share tomorrow at the directors meeting about how we're working with our Office of Communications and Public Liaisons to feature the centers a little bit more on the interwebs. So that's kind of why we need this additional information that is already asked upon in your RPPR. Another RPPR kind of question is the inclusion across the lifespan. It's a policy that was in place for applications received after January 2019. And so for each person that you include in your inclusion report, that person needs an age. And there are videos and there are guides to help you work within the EAR common system to upload this data and match it to your participants. And if you have any issues and we can't help you, at NIA, we have a human subject specialist that we could guide you to and help you work out the best instructions for that process. Secondly, it's kind of like it's still the pandemic. And so if you could email me or Grayson with your plans for your inpatient visits or the date that you started inpatient visits and what percentage of visits that you're having per week, if you're at 50% capacity or 25% capacity or 100% capacity. We really need that. We would like that information just to understand how the pandemic is affecting the program overall. And, you know, there's 31 of you. And so we just need to make a big table of all that data. So if you could send that to us, that would be great. And finally, based on what we're planning to do for October, if you could update us on your institution's travel policy and whether you can travel in October or soon, or you're already traveling for your institution. So if you can update us on those policies, that would be excellent. Thanks for the updates. And like I said, if you want more, we could do a separate meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Cerise. Next, we have an update on biospecimen best practices from Krista Moulder at WashU.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to Emily and the steering committee for letting me give you a quick little update on this. So this will be brief, and the whole process, I've been slower at this than I intended, but I think a lot of us have gotten waylaid during the pandemic, so we're still soldiering on. Just as a reminder, these guidelines were last updated in 2014, so Nina's been keen to get new versions out there, so we're not 7 years out of date. One thing as we've been having our most recent discussions is that this new version will not just be biospecimens. I'm going to highlight a couple of things on the next slide. So it's going to be more a best practices document than just a biospecimens best practices. One thing that we also really wanted to emphasize, because we've gotten a lot of questions about this, even as the different groups were putting together the different sections, is that this resource is really intended as that. It's not my way or the highway, where no one is going to be requiring that every center do things to the letter that are in these guidelines. They really are intended to be a resource, particularly for the new centers, perhaps the P20s or just some of the newer centers, or for centers who are looking into a new area of research. For example, you might never have done iPSCs before, so you're looking at how to get into that. So they're kind of, as the title suggests, just best practices. It's not a dictum that this is how you have to do. If you think you need to use a polypropylene tube versus a polystyrene tube, no one's going to hunt you down. We also want this to be a more living document. We don't know exactly how this is going to work. We're hoping to perhaps have an option on the NACC website to request content updates or suggest other areas that need attention. So we don't intend for this to sit static for the next 7 years. We are hoping that, especially some of these fields are going to evolve more than others. So that's sort of our vision for the best practices. These are the different sections that are going to be included, and you can see a little bit more than half, or maybe 2/3 are ready for posting now, and you can see those areas. There's some on the right that are still a bit in process. And you can see the EAC guidelines that John Morris, our director, put together. Those are going to be included in the best practices. So that's one of the examples of how this isn't just biospecimens. And then also on the right, for example, rigor and reproducibility are also, we have some links that we're going to use for now, but we might develop that further. I have saliva in red there because we're sort of trying to decide whether saliva should be in one section versus another. But we're sort of in a process and close to getting a little bit more than half of them posted. And I just wanted to thank everyone for, as administrators, we are the cat herders of the ADRCs. I just want to thank everyone who's been working on this project. It's been a real team effort. So Annie Bars, Hanny Blazel, Kelly Faber from NCRAD. I'm going to name her as an honorary administrator. She stepped in when Brad Glazier retired and has just been amazing contributor. So, I bestow the official honorary administrator title onto Kelly. Emily Little and Andrea Wasserman, and of course Grayson and Nina for just helping keep me on track and keep soldiering forward. So I'm working with NACC now, and hopefully we will have that first graph or first table of things ready to be out there very soon. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Krista. Next, I'm excited to hear about the NACC Communications Strategy Update. We'll be hearing from Rado Lee and Amy Young on this.
Thank you, Emily. Amy, would you mind sharing your screen? Okay. Hi, so my name is Rado Lee. I'm the Manager of Program Operations at NACC. So before Amy begins her presentation on the communication updates from NACC, I'd like to make a very brief announcement about the U01 Cooperative Agreement at NACC that provides a lot of subawards to the ADRCs. The grant is ending on June 30th, 2021. There will not be any carryover or NCE, no cost extension, allow for your existing subaward as our grant is switching from U01 to U24, effective July 1, 2021. So we started receiving a lot of inquiries recently regarding this matter from the ADRC. So please keep this in mind as you're preparing to close out your grant in the next couple of months. The final invoice for your subaward will be due August 27th, Friday, to the University of Washington for all of the work that must be completed by the grant end date of June 30th. The RPPR documents, which will reflect the accomplishments and outcomes of the funded projects, including the new investigator awards granted since July 1, 2018, and other administrative supplements such as CSF biomarker, digital biomarker, Down syndrome module, and others, will also need to be submitted to NACC by the end of August 2021. And we'll send an email reminder in the next few weeks about that. So if you have any questions or concerns about the subawards or any contracts and grant matters, please reach out to me anytime. My email address is on the slides, radolee@uw.edu. And that's all the update that I have on this particular matter. So I'll pass on to Amy to begin her presentation on the communication updates.
Thank you, Rado. As Rado said, my name is Amy Young, and I am the new Public Information Specialist here at NACC. And I'm excited to be with you today to share some of the new communication initiatives that we're working on at NACC. I recently heard a business podcast on NPR, and it said, data is the new gold. And I started to think about that in terms of NACC and the ADRCs and our shared data. And it said that data is the new gold. So companies who can leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence will be the leaders of the new digital economy. When I think about this in terms of NACC, I think, well, maybe our data is the most precious type of gold. Whereas companies are leveraging data for money or profits, NACC data is really about time. It's about accelerating the time to develop new therapies and treatments for Alzheimer's, and hopefully accelerate the time for a cure. And perhaps more importantly, it's about creating time for people who are living with Alzheimer's and their families, and ultimately about more time with the people that we love. So I'm excited to share with you, like I said, a lot of the communication things that we're all working on. And one of the most important things is how do we communicate the NACC and the ADRC story? And what is that story? And who do we need to tell it to? So I know this is a complicated slide, but it kind of gives you an idea of all the things we're thinking about in regards to communications here at NACC. because what you guys do is pretty complicated. But it also offers opportunities for us to really interject communications into all we do and across all the platforms that we share together. I want to just take a look. Here are some of the current things that we're looking at NACC. We have a lot of different channels: social media, website, Slack, email, all of those opportunities to really kind of develop a cohesive brand, an inclusive brand that represents NACC and the ADRCs well. So we'll be looking at all these different platforms over the next year, and you'll start to see them refresh over time. So one of the first important things we're going to do is to rebrand NACC and refresh all of those channels. And when people think about brand, they think about maybe a logo or a tagline or new colors. But branding is a lot more than that. It's really about positioning and messaging. And do we have the right brand voice and tone? And that really then infuses into the content strategy in all that we do. So I'm very excited to develop an inclusive brand. And one of the first things I learned here at NACC, and maybe it was my first meeting with Bud, one of the things he said to me really stuck with me. He said, it's not about us and them, it's about all of us together. So whatever we do at NACC is always going to be with that in mind. And now for some of the exciting things. This year, you'll see NACC website 2.0. So we hope that it's a much more engaging website. It'll have more fresh content on it. We'll have a blog where we can highlight some of our successes and some of our wins. It'll have community content. I want to integrate contact from the ADRCs, if you're hosting events, all of those sorts of things. We want to infuse some life into the front end of the website. The data team's been doing a great job at working on the back end, and now we want to refresh the front end. Some of the things you're going to see are a personnel directory. You're going to see a new REC learning platform. We're working with REC right now to develop a website that'll host trainings and videos and all sorts of resources, like how to apply for your first grant or your second grant, all those kind of resources so that we can share them across a knowledge portal or a learning management system. So I'm very excited about working with REC on that project. You also see updates on the NACC portal. We're looking at maybe sort of multi-tiered access to the website where you can get some resources for everybody, and maybe another layer where you get the knowledge portal and some of those things, and then another level for the data and access to things like that. We're hoping to roll out the LEAF instance this year, where you're able to manipulate data and see what we have in the data set, and also REDCap. So this is one thing I've heard a lot about since I come here is the personnel directory. We need a new personnel directory. Well, we want to create one. I'm working with the data team now to develop one that'll be searchable across all platforms and devices, whether you're on your mobile or your desktop or your iPad. You'll easily locate everybody within the organization. And it'll include things, the typical things like maybe a photo or a name and title, but we'd really like to integrate sort of areas of interest. Because one of the things I'm hearing at this, as everybody's talking this morning, is about how to collaborate. How can we collaborate better? How do we network better? And we really want the personnel directory to be a linchpin in that sort of connection with each other. And the NACC communications platform. Well, this is probably the one that you're most familiar with because we've been using it to run the event and the conference. And I'll admit there's been a few hiccups here and there, but I think overall, I hope you see a fresh new look for NACC communications. So we've brought on this platform that you're seeing. It's called HubSpot, and it allows us to do a CRM, which will be hooked to the personnel directory. You'll be able to update your own personnel directory and your own profiles. It runs all of our email campaigns, which then connects all of the different pieces that we do, whether that's social media, the website, the knowledge portal, all of that is going to get connected together with this communications hub. We'll be able to do press release, run more events on this, and also connect up with you better across all of our various channels. So we're very excited about all the things that are happening here at NACC. And I really want to encourage you to give us feedback as we go, because it's an iterative process and we're very open to your feedback. We want to make it better for you so that you can share better insights, collaborate more, and hopefully accelerate that time for a cure. So thank you very much. It's been my honor to be with you all today.
Thank you, Amy and Rado. Our next speaker is going to talk to us about the neurological manifestations of COVID and plasma biomarkers. So we're going to need to switch screen sharing here. And I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Thomas Wisniewski to talk to us about this topic, and thank Karen Marsh in advance for helping to moderate questions.
So I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this session for giving me the opportunity to present. I'll be briefly reviewing some of the basic facts about COVID-19, the NYU experience regarding neurological manifestations, and some preliminary data on plasma biomarkers. So these are some of the awful statistics associated with the pandemic. A light at the end of the tunnel, at least for the United States, is that thus far, about 46% of our population has received one dose of the vaccine. Unfortunately, globally, the numbers are pretty bad, with over 3.3 million dead, and just 9% or so of the global population having received one dose of vaccine. The common COVID symptoms are outlined here. However, in the older adult population, this infection often may lack a specific infection type symptoms, and older individuals can present with altered mental status and delirium, in particular if there is a pre-existing neurological cognitive deficit. This can make accurate and early diagnosis quite challenging in this population. Unfortunately, there's a major association between COVID-19 risk and the presence of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, with a threefold increase in the risk of infection and a doubling of the potential for mortality. Residents in long-term care facilities are at much higher risk, as these numbers illustrate. In addition, in 2020, there has been an excessive mortality reported in Alzheimer's and related dementia subjects, consistent with the lack of reporting of COVID in this population, and also perhaps this population having difficulties in getting adequate health care in relation to the pandemic. Grim numbers. Unfortunately, there are also significant racial and ethnic health disparities regarding the pandemic, with African Americans being twice as likely to get infected, and African Americans with dementia being threefold more likely. In nursing homes that take care of a high proportion of individuals from underrepresented groups, those facilities have reported much higher rates of infection in comparison to facilities that have lower number of URGs. And again, unfortunately, in Black and Hispanic individuals, there has been a much lower level of COVID vaccination. In order for the SARS-CoV-2 virus to enter cells and induce infection, there needs to be expression in the cells of a number of key proteins, as illustrated in the cartoon on the left. These critical proteins are indeed expressed by cells of the central nervous system, so neurons and glia. So potentially the CNS can directly be infected by this virus. There are a number of potential routes by which SARS-CoV-2 can enter the CNS and mediate injury. It can infect sustentacular cells of the olfactory system and thus enter into the olfactory tracts and the rest of the brain. It can enter the brain via the vagus nerve through its terminals in either the respiratory tract or the GI tract. The virus also can directly infect pericytes and endothelial cells of the blood-brain barrier, thus disrupting the blood-brain barrier, allowing virus entry. This can also induce thrombosis and secondarily lead to ischemic damage and hemorrhages in the brain. In addition, the systemic infection can induce massive release of cytokines, which can also be associated with breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. And this cytokine storm can, in addition, induce autoimmune damage of the central nervous system. The neuropathology in SARS-CoV-2 luckily has shown very limited evidence of direct virus infection, but certainly there is clear evidence of extensive secondary damage with microgliosis and astrocytosis, so inflammation, in particular in the brainstem, cerebellum, and olfactory system. There is evidence of vascular damage and also perivascular cytotoxic T-cell infiltration. In studies where qPCR and immunohistochemical methods have been used to detect the virus, up to 50% of postmortem brains are showing virus directly in the CNS. There is a very clear evidence in most of the Neuropath studies of vascular and blood-brain barrier disruption, as illustrated in this manuscript by Lee et al. From the New England Journal. And this blood-brain barrier disruption allows fibrinogen, shown in green, to pass through the blood-brain barrier and infiltrate into the brain parenchyma, as shown in the olfactory bulb here and in the pons. In the lower panel in the micrograph, this clear thinning of the basal lamina and blood-brain barrier disruption, allowing fibrinogen to infuse into the brain parenchyma. At NYU, we conducted a prospective study of hospitalized COVID patients looking at a comparison of individuals that developed new neurological events versus those that did not. And this slide shows our inclusion and exclusion criteria and the control population. The numbers are shown here. So during this period, we had almost 4,500 COVID-19 patients admitted to the major NYU hospital sites in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Long Island. This was 35% of all admissions during this period, putting a major strain on the NYU healthcare system. 606 of these individuals, 14% of the total hospitalized cohort, developed new neurological events as part of their infection. These events are listed here. Most commonly, there was a toxic metabolic encephalopathy. But we also had many patients with new seizures, hypoxic and anoxic damage, ischemic strokes, and then a variety of other neurological new events, including cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Importantly, we did not have any individuals that developed new COVID-related meningitis or encephalitis. So that direct infection of the CNS by the virus is quite uncommon. In terms of the causes of the toxic metabolic encephalopathy, septic encephalopathy and hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy were the most common, followed by uremic encephalopathy related to the renal damage that occurred with COVID-19. However, in 78% of these patients, there was more than one cause of the toxic metabolic encephalopathy. So these patients were quite difficult to deal with. Individuals with this complication tended to be older, and the existence of a pre-existing cognitive dysfunction greatly elevated the risk of developing toxic metabolic encephalopathy in our cohort, a 9-fold elevation of risk. We did 6-month follow-up of this hospitalized COVID cohort. Again, comparing the folks that didn't have new neurological complications with those who did. And unfortunately, in both groups, there was significant 6-month long-term complications, with impaired cognition being extremely prevalent. And 50% of both of these cohorts, there was subjective cognitive impairment and MoCA scores less than 18. The median age here was between 65 and 70. So in this population, one would have expected much better cognitive performance. There was also clear limitations of many activities of daily living. And unfortunately, in the subset of folks that had the new neurological complications, they did significantly worse, including worse scores on scales like the modified Rankin scale that's used to follow post-stroke complications, and a number of other scales, including worse performance on cognition on MoCA. In this population, we were also interested in evaluating biomarkers related to Alzheimer's disease, neuronal damage, and neuroinflammation. We used these state-of-the-art techniques with Simoa, highly sensitive method that can detect 10 to the minus 15 concentrations of these biomarkers in the plasma. This shows the characteristics of the 310 patients we had plasma samples available, and we compared those with neurological symptoms to those without. All these subjects had hospitalized COVID. In the individuals with new neurological symptoms, there was a very significant increase of neurofilament light protein in the plasma. This indicates neuronal death and damage. There was also very significant increases of glial fibril acidic protein and astrocytic protein, signifying a massive increase of neuroinflammation. And these levels are what one would see with the quite significant traumatic brain injury. In addition, the levels of total tau, signifying neuronal damage, were elevated, and significantly the levels of phosphorylated tau, which is linked specifically to neurofibrillary tangle pathology, tau pathology, this was also much elevated. So these neurological manifestations with SARS-CoV-2 infection were quite common in our population. The presence of these complications was associated with a big increase in mortality and poor outcomes at 6-month follow-up. These neurological manifestations were associated with marked elevations of CNS damage and Alzheimer's related pathology in the plasma. And these findings may indeed indicate that these COVID-19 infected individuals may have an acceleration of AD and ADRD symptoms and pathology, although this hypothesis clearly requires longer longitudinal follow-up, something that we're very much interested in doing. This was a huge team effort with the involvement of many members of the NYU ADRC team, but also many faculty members in the neurology department at NYU. And it was made possible with administrative supplement funding that we were very glad to be able to utilize very useful funds. And this picture just shows our ADRC NYU team in happier, non-socially distant times, something that we hope we'll be able to return to in the relatively near future. Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Wisniewski. There is a question for you. So did you look at any cytokines using Simoa? And if so, was there any association between neurodegenerative markers and level of systemic inflammation? What about vascular injury markers?
So these are things that we are looking at now. So we haven't done that yet, and we very much are interested in using the same vascular markers that Donna Wilcock presented, the same as MARC and VCID. So we're interested in following those biomarkers, the cytokines, as well as doing neuroimaging studies to look for evidence of blood-brain barrier damage and ischemic damage. So we would want to comprehensively map out all these things and see what correlates with cognitive dysfunction.
And yes, that question was from Donna Wilcock.
Ah, okay. Yes. Thanks, Donna. Yeah, we want to use the same biomarkers as you're using.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Wisniewski? Okay, so that's all we have right now in the chat and the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. Next up, we have Dr. Dirk Keene here to share with us some of what has been learned through the survey on COVID-19 impacts on ADRCs and the neuropathology core operations. I think this may be a preview of more to come, but the administrators thought that this would be a very hot topic for today's meeting. So thank you, and to Sharon in advance for helping with the questions in this section.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. I assume that people can see that.
Looks great.
Great. So it's wonderful to follow up Dr. Wisniewski. I think the message is, the writing is on the wall for our ADRCs and our research subjects and participants. You know, COVID is clearly having an impact on the central nervous system. It sounds like it may be already showing up with respect to the Alzheimer's disease, symptoms and signs and symptoms. And so to really understand what's happening, what's underlying those symptoms and the biomarker information and what's going to happen to our subjects as they move forward, those who've had COVID-19 infections and those who, compared to those who haven't, is going to be in large part dependent upon the neuropathology that we use to evaluate these folks when the time comes when they pass away. And so I'm just trying to move the videos. So we need to be able to do the Neuropath course need to be able to do their business as much as ever to try to capture, especially the early cases of people who've had COVID-19. And so I'm just going to show a few slides describing the UW experience, but most of this is about a survey that we wrote to the Neuropath course and others that I'll talk about in just a second, to try to understand what is the impact of the pandemic on Neuropath course. So this is a slide that I've shown in a lot of different talks. It's evolved last spring ADC meeting. I guess it's the ADRC meeting now. I was invited to present our experience to date at UW. You know, the pandemic started really, really early here, and January 21st was the first case in Washington and nationally. And we had the first death in the United States in Washington as well, at least the one that was known. And so that really impacted our Neuropath core operations from the very outset. And so this, I'm not going to go through this, but this just highlights the scramble that we went through at UW to try to maintain operations during incredibly uncertain times. And it really evolved around how do we protect our staff, and how do we understand the risk of the donors that we're receiving. And so this ultimately culminated in using an isolation suite with different mechanical and engineering controls, using rapid PCR tests to diagnose our donors, and then ultimately not using tests to determine whether we can do the brain donation procedures because we're in isolation and we're protected, to try to maintain operations. So by April 28th, and I can tell you, I didn't sleep very much for this few months, we were fully operational. but it really took a lot of work. And the only way that it happened was because we had wonderful collaborators with our medical examiners. The University of Washington was extremely supportive rather than being restrictive. And we thought this probably is going to have an impact on the Neuropath course. So these are the key elements I've gone through. It's an involved process to be able to make sure that we're safe and to be able to accept these donations in people who you don't know their COVID status and you don't know the risk. And so we developed these protocols and again, thought, what is happening to the rest of the Neuropath course? So what do you do when you don't know something? Well, in the absence of a really nice, good experimental protocol, you design a survey. So that's what we did. And we had a lot of help. I have to call out Erica Malif and my group, who really has been spectacular. The Neuropath Core Leaders Steering Committee provided a ton of input, and then the Neurobiobank directors as well, along with Nina and Abigail, and then Tish Havel, all of whom you probably know very well. We designed a survey. The survey went to brain banks around the world. We tried to identify every brain bank we could find to send this survey to, and we got a lot of emails back for empty addresses or whatever, but we definitely focused on the Alzheimer's Center Neuropath cores as our primary target to really understand. And the data I'm going to present here is just on the ADRC Neuropath core responses. We have about twice as many responses as what I'm going to show, and I'm happy to talk about that down the road, but most of the respondents align pretty well with what we see in the ADRCs. So we got 24 responses from ADRCs. One of the responses was pretty limited, and so most of the data is summarizing 23 of the centers that have responded to the survey. So just to go through the survey, this is not, nothing special. I'm just going to run through the questions. I'll try to do it reasonably quickly and take any questions at the end. Probably the most important and not so surprising fact was the first question was, did you modify operations? So one Alzheimer's center did not have to modify operations during the pandemic, but everybody else that responded had to modify operations. So we already see there's an impact. How did you modify the operations? So there's a good chunk of people who've had to add COVID-19 screening. And remember, the responses that I've got are as of February. So this is not completely up to date. And I'll talk about that at the end. So COVID screening and COVID testing are both primarily the issues that people have had to come up with, some modifications of collection procedures, and then there's a significant chunk of centers that actually had to close. That obviously is a major issue. And so just with respect to the closed operations versus limited operations, you can see that just about every Neuropath core, at least that responded to this survey, had some impact to their operations, either being limited or closed, meaning missed brain donations. The second question was, how long were operations closed? The responses ranged from just a couple weeks to 30+ weeks. But as of February, every one of the Neuropath cores was open for business. And how were the operations limited? Like I said, there was a lot of COVID screening involved. And if COVID positive or suspected cases came through, a lot of centers were not accepting those brains. I think we'll talk about that in a second. And then, of course, a lot of us had delays. That was our biggest problem here, was the delays to get testing before we could do the procedure, which affected our postmortem intervals significantly for a while there. And then, of course, one of our issues was having to have an alternate site, an isolation suite, to do our protocols. So we asked, have referral numbers changed? So this is basically your experience during the pandemic when the survey went out. And most referral numbers didn't change. There was a split between the numbers that went up and went down. I suspect, if you were in New York in April, you might have more donations. But I've been surprised here in Seattle that we have not actually seen a significant increase in cases with the pandemic. Survey question 4. If you've declined brain donors that you normally would have accepted, why? And most of the time it's COVID-19 suspected or positive cases, or the institution just won't allow you to do your work. And that's been a big issue for a lot of places. Like I said, the University of Washington was extremely supportive. But institutions had to prioritize response to the pandemic, not research. And I understand in a lot of places that limited the amount of work that people could do from a Neuropath Core perspective. Have you had to decline brain donations due to this COVID screening? We were really particularly interested because a lot of centers are just asking caregivers or loved ones questions about the COVID-19 status of the decedent. And you had a majority of the people who are asking these COVID screening questions that had declined donations based on these screening questions. Our experience was that we were just screening with questions, and then we had a positive case come through that got everybody worried. So then we had to convert into PCR testing. And if they had declined brain donors, how many? So we just asked, how many have you lost? This is again, as of January, February, the range of responses was up to 25 donations that had been missed. And the total as of the survey results that we had in February was 96 missed brain donations. So not trivial. These are presumably clinical core, people who are going to NACC, who are in the clinical core, who will not have neuropathology. Have you had to stop and delay tissue requests, right? One of the primary goals of a Neuropath Core is to support research through tissue requests. And the vast majority of Neuropath Cores were also impacted for their tissue sharing. And if that was the case, then the question was why, and the vast majority of respondents basically said, we have limitations from our institution based on safety protocols or other restrictions that make it difficult or impossible to commit to tissue sharing at this time. Difficulty with PPE, this was a big issue for us. We scrounged N95s, we reused N95s like crazy. We found old pappers that nobody wanted that we refurbished in order to work. And so we just asked, and actually it was encouraging that most of the groups managed to deal with the PPE shortages pretty well. And the massive response was, yeah, it was tough early, but everything got better quickly. What about the evaluations, right? I mean, we need to, once we have a brain donor, we want to know what was happening so that we can provide that data to NACC, provide that data to our center and our center researchers, and correlate that with whatever the other parameters were with respect to, cognitive testing, et cetera. And so what was happening to the neuropath evaluations, and the majority of respondents or issues with the neuropath evaluations said that something was affected. A lot of that was turnaround time, sampling, histology, right? All of the components were impacted, although there were five centers that had no delay in their turnaround time. So that was really great. And why were the neuropathological evaluations delayed? And the reduced access and social distancing were the two primary reasons. So costs, right? We wanted to know about costs, and the majority of centers had added costs. Most of this was around COVID-19 testing and PPE requirements, but there were also administrative costs, as you can see here, personnel costs and diagnostic costs. And then this is again, as of when the survey went out, are you screening current donors for COVID-19? The vast majority of centers are screening. And how are they doing it? Well, it was split between a questionnaire and actually PCR testing between the centers. We're doing both here, and there were some centers that checked both. And then if you find a person who's positive, are you taking them? And as of the survey responses back at the beginning of the year, the majority of centers, the slight majority, were not accepting COVID positive cases. I think that's getting better, but I know there are quite a few centers that are still not able to accept COVID positive cases, which really gets to the heart of the matter with respect to Dr. Wisniewski's and these neurological manifestations, right? If we have people who've been affected, we really need to understand what's happening in their brain in the short term, and then of course in the long term. So hopefully this is being mitigated as we speak. Survey question 15, is there a change in donor frequency during the pandemic? So this was kind of a duplicate from one of the earlier questions. And we got kind of similar results. No change was a little bit lower. Before it was 73%, I think. And there's still a bit of a split between increased and decreased donors. I think when this was done, we were starting to see more donors coming in than earlier in the pandemic, which was where the original question was sort of going. And then for the collected specimens, what happened to the PMI? And it has increased as expected because of issues with testing for COVID, for sure, isolation suite and PPE issues, that sort of thing, and coordination. So there's been quite a bit of an impact. Are you collecting frozen tissue? Frozen tissue forms the heart of so much research, right? And you can't do a lot of the really important applications that are traditional and cutting edge without frozen tissue. The good news is we are getting a lot of frozen tissue still from our Neuropath cores. The bad news is we're not getting a lot of that from COVID so much, or we're getting less from COVID positive people. And so again, when we want to go in and ask questions about cytokines and other things in the brain, we're going to be limited with respect to our ability to analyze that in COVID positive cases because there will be less fresh tissue. And then again, back to sharing tissue. Are you currently sharing tissue? And most people are sharing tissue, but there's a bit of a split around what people are sharing. The majority of, most of the banks, like I said, are sharing tissue. Some are including COVID positive cases. Some are limited to fixed and COVID positive or COVID negative cases. And I get the sense that that's highly related to institutional policy. We really could use some sort of national guidelines with respect to how we should be doing this with respect to the ADRCs. I think it would be helpful in a lot of the topics from this survey for us to lobby our administrators with respect to how we run our brain banks if we had something to refer to on best practices for COVID-19 positive biospecimens. And to my knowledge, we don't have that yet. If we do, if somebody could please point me to that, that would be great. And then finally, how are you collecting the specimens, right? And part of the added cost is the protection that you have to provide to your in-house staff. Some banks also utilize outside technicians, and of course, many banks, many cores operate with multiple different iterations, depending on where their donors are from. And so, in all cases, we are required, I think, ethically, if not in other ways, to make sure that the people doing these procedures are protected. And so it's been an important issue for us, and I'm sure everyone else, to make sure whoever is doing these collections has all the appropriate PPE and engineering controls. So to summarize this survey, and again, it's a survey, it's not a scientific survey. I'm a neuropathologist. I don't typically design surveys, but I think we have a clear picture that NP cores have been almost uniformly affected by the pandemic. All but 3 centers reported missing some number of brain donations. Some centers have been under real duress with respect to closures and other restrictions. And other impacts, of course, we've had delays to our neuropath evaluations. I know that's been a big issue for us. Social distancing just limits the amount we can get done from our neurohistology team. Limited tissue collection and tissue sharing, of course. And then I think I would be surprised if there were that many centers that didn't have some added costs, whether they're easily identified or not. So I put this slide in here. I presented this slide last year at this meeting to say, what do we need? What is the Neuropath core going to look like in the future? Well, we needed widespread immunization, right? We're actually doing pretty good there. We needed effective therapeutic interventions. Well, I mean, people still are dying from COVID-19, but there's been a lot of success in protecting people with or treating people with COVID, although not to the level where we can be cavalier about protecting our staff. And then data on risk of infectivity from autopsies. There's a lot of anecdotal data. There's not much other data. We really need to understand what is the risk. Rapid testing, that's pretty standard in a lot of places now. The engineering controls, those were coming online, and I think most cores now have the engineering controls that they need. PPE is relatively readily available. And then we all have access to serum serologies to find out what the sort of history of these folks are with respect to COVID infection and now vaccination. So, Erica and I are planning a follow-up survey to sort of wrap this up, to give all of us and the NIH an idea of what this has meant to the Neuropath cores. These are some of the questions that we have got in this survey. I want to thank the Neuropath core leaders for the time. This is not a trivial survey to fill out. We've gotten a lot of really detailed responses that have been really wonderful. And I hope that people will fill out this follow-up survey. We can update the numbers. And as we all get vaccinated, or most of us get vaccinated, and as we hopefully are able to move back to better times with respect to our Neuropath core operations, we'll be able to assess, what really is the impact of COVID on what we were able to do, but more importantly, to understand how it's impacting our participants from a neuropathological perspective, so that we can compare people who've had infections and have not, assess the vascular brain injury going forward, assess our AD pathology, and get a sense of what this pandemic is going to mean to our research. So with that, I want to thank, that's not even close to everybody that has helped with all this, but it's been a real pleasure to work with so many people. I have an amazing team, and this is just the folks that have been sort of working directly on this survey and the autopsy program, and then a wonderful group of collaborators locally and nationally. Nina has been incredibly supportive, and I want to thank the folks who organized this for inviting me to present. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keene. That was a really great presentation, and it really highlights the struggles that the Neuropath cores are facing in this really challenging time. If you have questions for Dr. Keene, please post them in the chat or the Q&A. And while we wait for people to do that, I'd like to ask if the Neuropath cores are discussing best practices for autopsies and collecting tissue to help protect the staff. I mean, you discussed a number of strategies that you're using at UW, but is there going to be kind of a systematic recommendation for strategies to use?
It's a wonderful question. So when this all as this has developed, I think all of us have been constrained by our local regulations and the local support that we have to get things up. So every one of us has sort of taken this on locally first, and there's been a lot of different solutions to these problems. I mean, what we've done at UW is different than what's being done at a lot of other places. Whether or not, so I don't want to speak for the Neuropath core leaders steering committee, because that would be the purview, I think, of the steering committee more than any other folks. But what we're hoping is with this survey to at least identify trends and solutions that people have come up with. Part of the stuff that I didn't present is asking people, how are you approaching this to make sure that you're able to accept these donations in the appropriate time and manner, but while protecting your people. And so my hope is that we can add something along those lines when we report this information. And I agree, it would be really nice for the Neuropath core leaders to get together in some way and just provide guidance for all of us as to how we should manage this. Is vaccination enough? I don't know that we know that answer. And so if not, then what should we be doing to have full operations but be safe?
Yeah, as I was listening to your talk, I was wondering if that were in place, if it would encourage institutions to accept brains that were COVID positive, that would increase their confidence level on the ability to keep their staff safe.
Yeah, I think it would be essential. Our environmental health and safety people are wonderful, but they always ask, right? Where's the literature? What can you reference to help guide us? And so it's right now it's CDC, and CDC has done a good job of updating their recommendations, especially recently. but we still don't have anything tailored to research brain donation. And so I would really like for the, maybe the MP Core Leader Steering Committee to think about, whether we could get a working group together or some subcommittee together to think about recommendations that would be based on data. And that's part of the problem. And maybe this is why they haven't taken it up yet, because there just isn't that much data out there.
Good point. Well, I don't see any additional questions posted in the chat or the Q&A, and I think we're running a few minutes behind. So unless somebody throws one up there quickly, then I think we can move on to the next speaker. And thank you very much.
Emily, you're muted.
Thanks, Annika. This next session, for the next hour, we're actually going to hear from multiple panelists. Annika will be moderating, and the administrators wanted to host this session because operations have been affected across all cores, and the administrators have been sitting in the hub of that and trying to keep things coordinated. So I think each center is taking a very different approach, and without further ado, I will start the slides here and let Annika talk to us more about all of the approaches that are being taken at different centers.
Thank you. So as we decided on this session, sort of how the post-COVID world might look and how it affects the pipeline through all the different cores and all the different implications, we thought we would get a better baseline of what all the different centers are doing. So we quickly designed a survey and sent it out the week of April 26th to 30th. And I maybe want to toot the administrator's horn a bit, because we sent out the survey once, and 6 days later we had 26 responses, and we didn't feel the need to send out a single reminder. So perhaps the true moral of this is send your survey to administrators if at all possible. The first question was about how is your clinical core conducting visits? Has everyone seen the full screen?
It's blown up so that it doesn't all fit.
It's blown up a bit in mine too. If that works for me.
That's good.
I drew these stats directly out of REDCap, and
now you have to switch to presenter mode.
The questions, the responses to the questions that are cut off on the left are actually on the top in red. So for example, the entirely remote options versus mostly remote, and so on. And the takeaway from this is that anything goes this particular week. There's some going entirely remote, there's some centers that are entirely in person, and everything in between. We had a free text response about who is being prioritized for your in-person visits. And most of the people responded something along the lines of a diagnosis, a lot of MCIs, vaccinated, as many as possible, some were new enrollees, and then the ones that are just standalone was only a single response by a center. So next slide. For thinking about the future, as we're starting to transition or have this light at the end of the tunnel, for those that would normally be seen in person before COVID, that is, not people who moved to telephone follow-up under normal circumstances, the people who would be normally seen in person, how would those people be seen in the future? And it looks like a lot of centers are thinking that there could be some remote elements that are here to stay. So that's that middle one with over 15 responses, 17 responses. A single individual might have some remote elements and some in-person elements. But again, there's a variety of responses and not a single one did that they're going to continue fully remote visits. Next slide. Then the next one is about e-consent. A lot of centers are not using e-consent. Of the centers that do use e-consent, there's a wide variety of things that are being used, from REDCap, DocuSign, Sign Now, Secure Consent, and so forth. So there's not a whole lot of standardization of e-consent. The part about the Part 11 compliance, they're either saying they're not sure or the system they used is compliant. So next slide. And this is the final slide. It's about the pivot to remote and virtual events for outreach and what the plans were for a lot of centers in terms of maintaining this. The vast majority of the responses was that they're going to keep a virtual option when they go back to the ability to see people in person, or the events can be conducted in person. So it seems like having two parallel or complementary outreach programs is going to be the way of the future. However, there's a lot of centers, or a significant proportion, that are still considering how they might approach outreach and the use of virtual platforms in outreach. And I think the summation of all of this survey is really that the centers are doing a wide variety of things in response to COVID. There's still a lot that they're considering of how to adapt to a post-COVID world, and what is going to stay remote and what may go back to in person, and other systems they're not considering yet. So thank you.
I was going to say, can we go to presentation mode, or this would work either, if that's fine. That's fine. That works fine for me. Good afternoon, everybody. And Annika, thank you for giving that nice overview. My name is Ari Bhomik. I'm the research administrator for the University of Michigan ADRC here. And we are, next slide, please. I'm just going to dive into a little bit about talking about remote consent implementation. And I would like to just say that there wasn't any playbook available when the pandemic hit us on how we would do consenting from seeing people who were in research and then in person. And so when we went into lockdown, the Office of Research here at the University of Michigan, the IRB Med updated the guidance for obtaining informed consent to help minimize the person-to-person interaction, as we were in full, no in-person visits were happening at that time. And the question arises on how best to obtain the informed consent from patients who were in isolation in light of the current lockdown that we had. The University of Michigan Office of Research came up with a solution for us, which was the Sign Now platform, which currently they said is free, but in the future they may charge us. So I'm looking forward to that bill someday, but right now it is free. Within the time we got that, we had to amend our protocol, amend our SOPs, and by July 1, the Michigan ADRC was able to use a remote electronic informed consent, which actually allowed us to not only use this platform, but we also got permission from the IRB to use old-fashioned mail, fax. Some of my RAs asked me what a fax machine was, using electronic pictures and as a JPEG. And if you please hit next, we implemented the Sign Now platform. There should be a little arrow that pops up. And on the right-hand side, this is the Part 11 compliant platform that was provided. So we brought in all of these things here for the ADRC to do. Next slide, please. My very close colleague at NYU, Alok, provided me with some great slides here. And NYU put in on June 20th, June 2020, they actually implemented a REDCap-based survey for consenting, where Alok and his team optimized the multiple device types for e-consenting, where they were able to convert paper forms into readable JPEGs, and also made it more user-friendly as an interface, making it so that the participants could be able to utilize it well. And the REDCap survey that they based out there for capturing informed consent was able to also capture the signatures in a dedicated field. However, Alok, as he put in there, as of February 9, the NYU ADRC received approval for an IND and had to turn to back to the paper-based consent because e-consent that they had in place wasn't Part 11 compliant. However, they are looking right now at a REDCap-based, I think a REDCap Cloud and at Ripple Science platforms out there as alternatives so that they could probably reinstitute some kind of electronic informed consent. Next slide. And sticking to REDCap, I think all of you are very well aware of the wonderful presentation that Erin Chin and CC Manzanares from Emory and Wisconsin ADRC, along with Sage Bionetworks, gave a wonderful presentation about the web-based version of informed consent that they were developing and had done the testing there. The original project, if you can just hit next, please, which received grant funding from NIH, which was the e-consent platform. Pictures that you see on the right-hand side here were part of the completed non-inferiority testing on showing that e-consent is actually beneficial. And even though this platform right now in this form has not been implemented, both Emory and the Wisconsin ADRCs, if you hit next, please, currently are using a REDCap-based survey where they have actually embedded these iconographies into that so as to have them as a e-consent placeholder while they can implement the e-consent prototype in a web-based format that would be easily editable and which will also probably require more funding to take it to that stage, as I've been told. And finally, on the left-hand side of that slide, I do have a web-based format of REDCap from the University of Florida. The folks coordinating Center for the PACE DLB project, Caitlin which was very kind to provide this with us. The Michigan ADRC is one of their sites there, and we are utilizing this REDCap-based informed consent, which is text-heavy, but is compliant and does do the job for us right now. So if you could please go to the next slide. And again, summarizing this, this kind of brought in the things about what do you need for e-consent to be compliant and to actually be there. And so on the left, I have here, based from the University of Michigan's IRB collaborative task force that was put together when the pandemic hit us and we had to pivot to remote visits. Remote electronic consenting processes and systems, which we find need to be able to convey information to the participant in a proper manner, and also for the ability for study teams to obtain and document informed consent process. We also had to meet requirements on the in-person paper-based process, both from an institutional and a regulatory standpoint. Those had to be checked and had to be HIPAA compliant and FDA 21 Part 11 compliant for capturing of electronic signatures, which actually includes you having the ability to audit, track, and document those things there. And finally, in that summary on that side is the ability to prepare electronic consent forms, be able to edit them, update them, amend them, and HIPAA documents. And also, you should have a secure way where the consent forms would be sent electronically to the potential participants, their study partners, their LARs, and back to the study team. And also receive notification when those forms have been signed and if there's anything else that needs to be completed. And then that final part is also the capturing of the digital signature and any other information if you have any other HIPAA forms that are associated there. With regard to the pros and cons, I feel that these are probably just some of the very high level ones. Again, my colleague Alok from NYU did provide a slide there. And so when I was looking at everybody else's, it seemed that some of the major pros was the ease of compliance for having electronic informed consent the centralization of that, having that all in one place where you had these templates build up. The Emory, Wisconsin Sage Bio Networks e-consent process was very good. It had a self-pace factor in it. It was extremely interactive. And security is a big thing, right? Sending the consent form to the right person and getting it back. And how do you know that's the right person? So password protecting the access to these documents. And finally, as everybody knows, paper consents are probably what, 15 to 20 pages, depending on the complexity of the study there. So let's try and save some trees here. And I think that would be very big there for all of us. Some of the cons I did find was that everybody will need internet access to have access to an informed consent using the electronic version. Some consent forms were text heavy, as in our case. Technical support is required not only for the study team, but for the study participants and their co-participants. Doing these things on Zoom is not an easy thing. Just getting my parents to set up a Skype with me was like the biggest challenge I found. And then some of the other platforms that may not be supportive of assistive technology. And so again, happy to take more questions, but if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to thank everybody here who actually helped me with these slides there. So Erin, Cece, Alok, and Caitlin, and then the wonderful team that's here at the Michigan ADRC, the clinical core team that actually uses the Sign Now and actually implemented it and worked with our IRB to do that. So thank you.
Thanks, Ari. I'm actually just stopping the share for 1 second to see if I can get this into a better format for you all.
In the meantime, we were going to try to keep the questions until the end, but if there's any pressing question for I, you can probably take it.
Seeing something pop up. Your red cap, sorry, oops, your red cap and other e-consents allow for capturing metadata during the consent process. It's a good question. I'll have to ask that from our red cap support team out there. Right now, the platform we're using is we actually take our approved informed consent and we put it into the Sign Now platform, which allows us to do the signatures and the documentations of all of the initializations and dates out there. So the red cap question, I will have to get back to you on that. And then there's a question from Carrie Stevens. Are there any plans for disseminating consent capabilities across the ADRCs? Would it be helpful to talk with NACC about ways we can help facilitate that? I think absolutely. I think, like I said, there isn't a playbook. I think you have to definitely take into account all your IRBs and have them also be in agreement on those platforms that you have there. So I think that it's worthy of that discussion moving forward because we know that's beneficial. But I know there's probably other people. We can talk more later.
Yeah, and just to chime in from the survey, there's a handful of centers which are using e-consent now, a variety of different platforms, but the majority of centers do not yet use e-consent. So the time is ripe to implement something more standardized now, or at least a recommendation for the centers to try to get the standardization soon, because I think e-consent will be up and up in the next couple of years.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Emily, could you exit out of the speaker view? The other view you had was fine. Yeah, that's fine by me if it works for you. All right, so I'm Bonnie Sachs. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist at the Wake Forest ADRC and the faculty in the School of Medicine. And first, I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak today about our use of remote UDS-3 cognitive assessments in the time of COVID and post-COVID. All right, next. Okay, great. So we're lovingly calling COVID-19 the mother-in-law of invention because you know, COVID-19 really forced us as neuropsychologists and as folks who are interested in cognition to think very out of the box about how to get away from this face-to-face, which is the gold standard for cognitive assessment. As we've heard very eloquently from some other speakers today, you know, older adult populations are particularly at risk. And so when it came to both clinical and research visits at our institution, certainly, and probably most of yours, we definitely had more than a pause. We had a shutdown, and I understand that while we're up back and running to some extent, some other institutions are not. Oops, let me turn the video on. Sorry about that. So this, of course, threatened the loss of data, but it also threatened the relationships and continuing to be engaged with our participants. So along with the clinical task force, several of us at Wake Forest were involved in creating 2 modified versions of the UDS cognitive battery that could be administered by phone. So the assumption was that not all participants would have access to video or to Wi-Fi, so the batteries needed to be amenable to that mode of administration. And so we had developed a core battery, and you can see the list of the tests here, and then an expanded battery, which included modified and substituted measures, but all could still be administered by the phone. So these batteries were rolled out by NACC for centers to use, and shortly thereafter we were awarded a supplement to really determine the feasibility and the tolerability of administering these batteries to both cognitively normal and cognitively impaired participants. So I'll talk about that last column there for just a moment, and then I'll come back to it in a minute. But in the last column, you can see a battery that really more closely aligns to the original UDS-3 battery. And we propose to use this battery in an R01 application that we submitted in March. And this will use video-only administration. By doing this, it permits the reintroduction of tests that have visual stimuli, like a visual naming test and a visual memory test, like the Benson figure. All right, next slide, please. Okay, great, thank you. So this schematic just kind of shows the breakdown of the pilot study that we did that was funded by this supplement. And essentially what we did is we took individuals from our clinical core who had already undergone face-to-face testing, including adjudication over about the last 6 months, and we randomized them to one of 4 remote groups. So they would either receive telephone administration or video administration in either that core or that expanded battery that I just showed you. We were well aware that a number of our participants may not have access to either a video device, a tablet, a computer, or Wi-Fi. And so we provided a loaned device. You can see it here in the lower right, called the GrandPad. And this was provided for them to avoid a selection bias against those individuals. The demographic breakdown of the individuals we enrolled was similar to that of our overall clinical core. And I did want to point out that we included participants who had normal cognition, MCI, and some who had mild dementia. All right, next slide. Okay, thank you. This is a busy slide, but I just want to point out we obtained a variety of data for this pilot study, both qualitative and quantitative, and both from our participants and our cognitive testers who did the assessment. In addition to that, we of course obtained the psychometric data about the tests. So the data that we obtained in the pilot show that the cognitive testers rated about 90% of these remote sessions as being valid. Interestingly, one reason that some were deemed questionably valid was because of the suspicion that participants were creative and wrote down some of the answers when they were tested by phone and they were not observed. This was particularly the case for the AVLT, where the words are repeated, and again by phone. Participants also were asked if they felt that the testing validly captured their cognition and their performance, and they also were in agreement. On average, they gave a rating of 9 out of 10, with 10 being the most confident for video, and then 8 out of 10 for phone. When we ask participants to rate the face-to-face sessions versus the remote sessions in terms of pleasantness and difficulty level, their ratings were actually very, very similar. When asked about preferring video versus in-person and phone versus in-person, we found slightly higher ratings of video as compared to phone. And this was predominantly due to issues like hearing problems over the phone. When we looked at the psychometric data, we saw that the correlations were mostly moderate to high between remotely administered tests and tests administered in person, but this was not the case for all. In particular, tests that had heavy psychomotor components, which is probably not surprising to many of us on this call today. All right, next slide, please. So, you know, I know part of this talk is about sort of the post-COVID world. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the experiences that we've had and where we think things may be going in the future. So based on the pilot, we do think that remote administration of the UDS is feasible and tolerable for participants with a wide range of cognitive functioning down to the level of mild dementia. And this is consistent with the larger psychometric and neuropsychologic data that we know about other types of, you know, clinical assessments. We did observe some challenges. This included primarily difficulties with hearing, technology difficulties, both access to and comfort with technology, and the fact that, again, participants on the phone were completely unobserved, which in some cases we felt like may have threatened data integrity on select measures. We did identify some ways to mitigate these, however, including the use of a loaned device. The GrandPad has built-in cellular connection with a variety of providers, and it's very, very simple to use. By using video assessment as opposed to phone assessment, we were able to you know, see people and sort of monitor what they're doing during the testing. And also by training our examiners really carefully to try to assess whether hearing or environmental issues may be a problem before starting the cognitive testing. So I think whether many of us are like it or not, it seems like some version of teleassessment will be around long after COVID is under control. And I think on Annika's slides, you know, that reflects, the responses from the centers reflect that this may be a permanent part, not to replace in person, but it may be an adjunct to some in-person portions of these exams. So I think that really underscores the necessity to have reliable and valid assessment measures and protocols that we can use. In that vein, we submitted an R01 partnering with 11 other centers and NACC to fully validate a video-only administered version of the UDS-3, which will be synced with the UDS-4. And again, that permits a more accurate and deep phenotyping cognitively of these individuals, because we can, again, reintroduce some of the stimuli that we can't do when we're limited to phone. Again, we'll be using that remote assessment technology I mentioned, the GrandPad, to ensure that all participants who wish to participate may. And again, kind of thinking to the future, perhaps maybe one silver lining of this is that by having a remote option, we might be able to reach people or retain people who otherwise might not come in for visits or might skip visits or just sort of opt to not participate. All right, next slide. And I just want to acknowledge the folks I work with here at Wake Forest and elsewhere. And that's it.
Emily, are we going to save the questions to the end now?
It's up to you.
Well, there was one question here that's very relevant. It was mentioned that some participants were thought to use external aids. How was validity of obtained remote cognitive data determined?
Yeah, that's a great question. We here at Wake Forest had you know, some experience using remote assessments in prior studies, and you know, to be honest, we were a little surprised that folks we found were using some of these aids. So we found out through a variety of means. Some of the participants actually told us. They said, you know, oh, that was so hard. I just like wrote down a couple of words. Sometimes and this was sort of early on, not part of the pilot, but we would sort of notice that scores would change dramatically and they would change in unusual ways. You know, participants would remember the list of words, you know, completely in order, which all sort of, you know, as neuropsychologists, we know that's not really how memory works. Or we would see really discrepant data between, you know, certain portions of the testing that really sort of clued us in that this may be a problem. So we started examining it more systematically by looking at, again, kind of the order of recall of some of the lists, the memory lists, and by specifically working with our examiners to you know, ensure that they, you know, by video at least, to ensure that they didn't have any stimuli out in front of, or any materials like paper and pencil, and to sort of, we encourage them to rate some of these tests as seemingly, you know, invalid or questionably valid if they had any suspicion at all that the participant was doing it. So we really, after we started to observe this trend, we really started to err more on the side of caution. And again, I think it's limited pretty much to this one type of test that we saw that pattern.
So we have 2 more presentations. So I think we're going to get to the presentations, but I'm making notes of any of the questions that come in, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them. We'll do our best.
Hi, can you hear me? Can people hear me? I hope so.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Can never tell. All right, I've tried to keep this pretty short because I know you wanted to keep the time down. So I'm the DMS core leader at the University of Washington. And I was asked to talk about sort of our response to change, really, in light of COVID-19. But I think the comments hold for other things too. So, oh yeah, I'm not driving the slides. Next slide. I just have a couple. All right, so yeah, okay, good. So, you know, as a DMS core leader, or the DMS core, we work with most of the other cores, particularly those that are generating data, the clinical core, the Neuropath core, biomarker cores, and so on. And so we're aware of a lot of the aspects, the general aspects of data collection and flow. And when something happens, you know, when there's a change in decisions or data collection or whatever in one core, we can often kind of anticipate the consequences of those decisions on other cores. We try to have regular intercore communication so things don't hit us by surprise, so we can actually plan around them. Sometimes we do better than other times at getting that communication. But it is, I do view it as one of our roles is to know what's going on so that we can make sure that data can move smoothly and that one core doesn't sort of broadside another core with some decision that makes a difference. You know, as a general core responsibility, I think for the data itself, what our role is to ensure high quality data and reliable quantitative conclusions when we do data analysis. So coming back to Amy Young's comment earlier on, you know, data is the new gold. That's really only true if the data are good. And if you haven't baked in confounders that lead you to inappropriate conclusions or incorrect conclusions. So, you know, it's one of our roles is to try and ensure that our data are reasonably complete, that they're accurate and they're reasonably clean. And one of the aspects of that I try to work on is I really do not like having what I call Swiss cheese data, you know, data that has holes, because that really limits what we can do analytically. I mean, there's going to be certain holes that are designed in, but to the extent possible, we don't want to have holes in data. And one of the things we also don't want to have is we don't want to have unknown data structure that we don't know about. because that really affects downstream analysis. Sometimes you can find it or find evidence of it, but it takes a lot of QC. And these people who aren't collecting the data, who Amy assumes want our golden data, aren't going to necessarily know what the sources of some of these data structure issues are. Those are batch effects. And of course, the whole COVID thing is a major batch effect in all of what we're collecting right now. So we also try and use best practices for all of the components of our data collection, study designs, et cetera. And that's often missing in the training experience of the patient-oriented scientists. So it's kind of our role to remind them what we need to do to make sure our data quality are good. So this is our, this is our mission. So go on to the next slide. Okay, so COVID hit. No. And we were Washington State was the canary in the coal mine. You saw Dirk's slides, and we had our first death at the end of February. And we were closing down by the 1st of March. I mean, we had a few days of time to get our acts together when our governor told us we're all going home. We're going to be doing everything from home. We had to gather things together hastily, try and make sure that we had a place to work at home, devices to work on at home, et cetera, et cetera. So we were kind of the canary in the coal mine. We had this big nursing home that had a lot of multiple deaths and really indicated that this thing was spreading. We were the first to impose occupancy restrictions to send us home. My first reaction was, oh my God, if this isn't just a few weeks, and I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be just a few weeks, this is a communicable illness after all. I thought our Alzheimer's disease projects are clearly going to be affected. We're going to have Swiss cheese data or something. So we had to think a little about what we were going to do. And my first thought, probably about March 3rd or 2nd, about the time Dirk was putting together a questionnaire, was we're going to have missed visits or late visits or something of the sort. We know this is going to happen. But there's going to be a shared reason for this. These aren't just random people who decided to take a visit to Florida and miss their visit. They're missing their visits because of COVID. They can't come in. We have this, occupancy restriction. We can't be in the same room. I wanted to make sure that we were gathering that kind of information, because if you have a very explicit reason that a lot of people are missing your visits, you can take that into account with your data analysis. It's not just random noise. It's a reason. So we wanted to capture the missing data. We want to minimize guessing about the reason for missing data downstream. And I think we were probably the first to contact NACC about just being explicit about this. I think it's now kind of explicit, but it took a while to actually get it into the NACC system. And we wanted to also start planning for what we felt were going to be parallel streams of data downstream. And we've had discussions of those issues already, that we would probably have both tele and in-person visits and so on. So that's new data collection, new indicators in our database that a particular visit was done by tele format versus in person and so on. So we have to capture that, and somehow we have to capture some information about the relative similarity or not of these tele versus in visit forms. So I'm pleased to hear that Wake Forest is actually doing some studies on that, because these kinds of studies need to be done for us to be able to compensate for the different ways we're collecting data. Other changes in data flow and collection have similar consequences, but usually, if we know ahead of time, we can plan around what we need to do to make sure that changes in the data capture don't have huge consequences downstream, like we did when we switched from UDS2 to UDS3. There's a big study that went on to sort of co-calibrate the open source instruments against what had been licensed instruments, so that we would have relatively, so we could make use of the data collected both ways. But that was a planned change, and it's a lot easier to do this kind of study when you have planned changes. But we may need to do some more work, to co-calibrate the tele and in-person visits if we're going to be doing a lot more of that going forward, because we don't really know how similar or how dissimilar they are. And it's going to make a big difference in terms of what we do analytically when we take the data and try to make inferences from it. Okay, I think that maybe, I think I'll just have the two slides. I just wanted to keep it pretty simple, but to sort of bring up these, yeah, that's the next person. So I just wanted to bring up these thoughts, because I think, you know, these are the key points, you know. We got a plan, and we got to think about what the implications are of our changes and what we can do to make sure that that what we are doing is the best we can under the circumstances. And some of these things may require some new funding. Some of it just takes some thought and some additional data capture. So I'm going to leave it there and just put those thoughts out there, because that's, I think, what we're thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll move on to Krista. And if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A or the chat. I'm monitoring both.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Crystal Glover. I am with the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, and I'm speaking today about OR activities during COVID-19 and some thoughts that I have about post-pandemic, or when things start settling down in terms of OR. Next slide, please. So I am a social psychologist and mixed methodologist by training. I also lead the OR Core at the RADC, and I am also chair of the OR Core Steering Committee. Throughout all of these efforts and whatever I do, I am a health equity and aging researcher. Next slide, please. So with that, at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, all of our efforts pre-pandemic have focused on diverse communities, especially in our OR Core efforts. So 2 large racial and ethnic minoritized communities in Chicagoland are Blacks and Latinos. So a lot of our efforts have been pre and during COVID focused on those communities, and some within Southeast Asian and other Asian American communities, and some burgeoning efforts within rural populations. Next slide, please. So when COVID hit, I kind of see what we went through as 3 big phases. So the first phase at the top is, oh, wow, this is really happening. That was around March 13th. So we worked with other OR cores, especially Ken Hepburn at Emory, Allison Lindauer at OHSU, to put together informational letters. What is COVID? What are the risk factors? How to stay safe during COVID, and especially for caregivers, keeping the persons, their loved ones living with dementia as safe as possible. So we disseminated that information via snail mail, electronic mail, and our social media platforms to have as far of a reach as we can to not only research participants, but community partners and just others in our communities in Chicagoland. But then by the second phase, we started getting our footing with remote. So that would be around May, that we really were able to flip, meaning getting our usual programming, so aging, Alzheimer's, risk factors, resilience factors, but really actually leveraging the resources at Rush and the community partners that we already had relationships with. Everything was centered around COVID. So we had town halls based on what's the impact of COVID-19, especially on Black and Latino communities. How can we have the proper use of PPE? Many in our communities wanted to use masks, hand sanitizer, but didn't know the proper way. We partnered with our memory clinic. So we had nurses there to demonstrate as we guided folks through the proper use. We also disseminated information for how community partners, participants can use Zoom, WebEx, also telephone to be on that, to be able to tap into it, because we are very aware of the digital divide, and just with many older adults and others not knowing how to use that. So we put together those materials and how to use the different platforms that we were communicating with various persons in the community. Then we started getting out there. That's the sort of third wave. So by, I would say, August or so, we were doing what I call curbside events. So we were doing PPE drives with other Rush partners, the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, where we had masks, educational materials, with thermometer, hand sanitizer, had contactless pickup. It was really quite elegant how the ORCOR team with study coordinators, et cetera, really helped schedule that. But then we were able to creatively flip one of our biggest events every year, the Back to School Health and Wellness Fair that we were doing in person before COVID. So we have everything from oral health to backpacks, clothing corner, food, about 300 to 500 people. Obviously, we could not do that during COVID. So with a great creative team thinking about, and we partnered with laundromats owned and operated by persons of color. How can we provide resources for laundering? So complementary laundering, especially for essential workers in Black and Latino communities, that really reaches the communities that we serve. They have multi-generational households, so there are older adults there. And we took that time to have informational materials not only on COVID, but also aging, staying active during COVID, eating habits, nutrition, PPE, you name it, at 5 laundromats. And it was quite successful. We may do that again. And then we were picking up our curbside events. So someone going back and forth between cars, how to deal with the holidays during the COVID-19 pandemic, you name it, we were there utilizing Facebook Live. So by the end of last year, we had caught our groove. Next slide, please. So as OR steering committee chair, it was really important for me to think about how are we leveraging two things, diverse communities and COVID-19. So how are we meeting the needs of these communities with OR efforts, but how are we creatively turning OR efforts to meet still Alzheimer's and aging during COVID-19. So we had 2 great panel discussions around that very topic. And you can see links here within the presentation on, we had diversity in diverse communities, racial ethnic groups, Indigenous, Blacks, Latinos, Asian American populations, LGBTQIA communities, sexual and gender minorities, faith-based communities. We even had Dr. Sophia Wang speak about the vaccine, what's in them, what are some misinformation, what are side effects you can expect, and also building trust. So we were leveraging not only what was at the RADC, but across all OR cores, and we really are focusing on what's going on in diverse folks, not just racial ethnic groups, but rural populations. How do we deal with the digital divide? How are we reaching people that need us most now? Last slide, please. So in going forward, we're thinking, especially at the RADC and potentially beyond, we need hybrid activities going forward. That means remote and in-person options. I do not think that will change anytime, say this year, perhaps. What we've considered and what we've been doing in Chicagoland at the RADC is really going with the flow in terms of the weather. During the warmer months, so say when we had late summer last year, early fall, we had those outdoor activities where we can have walk-ups, curbside, open air venues. But of course, during the winter and colder months, we had remote activities. But what does that look like for this winter, this colder fall? Socially distanced indoor activities, that's something we are willing to explore and thinking about here. But there are major factors to consider. One is overall, what are the community needs? Outside of aging, Alzheimer's risk factors, do they want to hear more about the pandemic, or the virus, vaccines, long-term effects? How can we develop materials across all OR cores to deliver that, especially being community specific, not just say one group, but neighborhood specific. That's how we generally work at the RADC. And that leads to comfortability, community and staff. Are people vaccinated? Are we still wearing masks, socially distanced? Do people want to leave out, even if it's indoor or outdoor? And then considering all of our things, all of our activities pre-COVID were community-based. Different neighborhoods being impacted by COVID differentially. Do they have the resources for us to be there? How may we assist with that? How can we facilitate health equity through ORCOR in considering the locations and comfortability of not only communities, but staff? And then lastly, really riding the wave and understanding what are pandemic spikes in the fall, winter, and how can we best anticipate those? Last slide, please. Of course, after this, I welcome questions. Please email me, and thank you for listening today.
Thank you so much. I think we'll go with a live question and then go to some of the questions that came in advance. This one is for Bonnie, I believe. For your R01, will you be cross-validating the tele-neuropsych version against in-person administration?
Yes, that's a great question.
And that's from Diane.
Yeah, that's a great question, Diane. We will be cross-validating it against in-person administration. So the administrations will happen within ideally a couple of weeks of each other.
So there's another question about the relative, and Ellen alluded to this, the relative quality of the telephone or remote visits against in-person. And so does it depend entirely on the question? Like are some things 100% the same, or are some things 10% less, are some things 50% less? Is there some sort of way you're going to be sort of quantifying the comparative quality of the data? Or is that simply dependent on the scientific question you want to address?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. So for our pilot, we were really interested in, is this even tolerable? Are we finding that patients with dementia just simply can't tolerate this procedure, or is it too long, or, those types of things. And so we did obtain some quantitative data about participants' experience with it, which I think is important. But from a more quantitative perspective, I think the data that we'll be looking for is how well do performances captured by telephone correlate with those done face-to-face. And then also a part I didn't speak about, but all of these folks have been previously adjudicated. And so we plan to adjudicate the remote, all of the remote visits, and to look at the agreement between the adjudication that was conducted in remote versus in person. So I think that kind of the quality question is could be looked at in, like you said, Annika, in a lot of different ways, depending on what exactly you were interested in. Was it tolerability? Was it pleasantness? Was it how closely that related to face-to-face data? So.
Great. Another question is, let's see. This could be answered by a couple of different people, perhaps Ellen. This is around data to some extent. Which proactive strategies would you recommend, or which remote components should be proactively integrated into clinical core visits?
Should, that's sort of a...
Well, it's not should, it's what would you recommend? Sort of which remote visit, which remote elements of, this is one asked in advance, and I'm trying to rephrase it slightly. It's sort of saying, okay, which remote elements are going to be the least disruptive, I think, in terms of the visit. It's probably the demographics, or something like that.
Demographics would not be affected particularly, I don't think, because it doesn't change.
Yeah.
But the actual cognitive measures probably all have at least some effect, some less than others. And we're using a certain set of measures right now, and switching abruptly has its consequences. I mean, there's going to be consequences for sure. I don't think the administrative stuff, I think the administrative stuff is probably fine. I've never been concerned about the administrative kinds of forms. And in the demographics, I almost think of it as administrative. The consent forms, that kind of stuff, I have no problem with because those are administrative. But the actual measures where you're trying to get a handle on somebody's cognitive, testing, even NACC, there's procedures for how you're supposed to go through this, and everybody's supposed to be using the same procedures because it makes a difference. For interpretation, for data analysis, for interpretation. These protocols have been worked out for a reason. And when you deviate from the protocols, what you get will probably not be equivalent. And that's going to bake in some batch effects. We have no choice but to do that under the COVID setting. But in going forward, I think what we need to do is figure out what the protocols need to be, even under electronic data capture, a remote data capture, so that at least we have some control over those procedures as best as we can, and then some co-calibration, which you guys maybe will provide for us. But there's probably a lot of little things that need to be worked out, and that's going to take sort of collaboration between the different clinical cores more than anything else to resolve.
Great. And Emily, I think we're at time exactly, aren't we? You're muted.
Yeah.
I want to thank all of the speakers today and all of the administrators as well for putting together this agenda.
Thanks so much, everyone. See you soon.